Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca and today is Thursday, January 26, 2023, and this is my weekly vlog. Before we get into the sewing project updates, I just want to give you an update on some of the tech issues that I've been dealing with. For those of you that have been around the channel a little bit, watching the live streams, you know I have been suffering from some technology struggles. This past weekend, I was able to dedicate quite a bit of my time to doing some troubleshooting, and finally, ultimately, we realized that what was wrong is hardware in the MacBook, and so we took it up to the Apple Store. They did some diagnostics and sent it out for repair. Turns out the two fans that I have in my MacBook have both just kind of given up. And so the computer was overheating. And if you don't know a lot about computers, essentially when your computer runs hot, your computer tries to slow down the CPU and some other resources that you have in an effort to keep it from running so hot. So we had to replace the fans to cool off the insides so that it could perform the way I need it to perform. The good news is I picked the laptop up last night and I am back ready to do all of the technology things. I don't know if everything has been solved. I haven't put it to the test, but it does seem to be a little bit more responsive than it was before we took it to the Apple Store. This past week has been a lot of fun. I've been doing a ton of organizing at work, helping to clean out storage rooms and office spaces that just have been neglected, and that has inspired me to do some decluttering and organizing here in the studio in my free time as well. So I think over the past week, I've probably spent more time decluttering than I have actually sewing, but I'll count it as a win. So my weekend review, let's talk about what I did do, and we'll start with the Beachy Braid quilt. When I talked to you last week, I mentioned that I didn't really know whether I wanted to keep the white as the background for the quilt or if I wanted to change it up. But the comments that I got from all of you definitely suggested switching gears to a tan for the background that kind of matches sand to really reinforce that beach theme, and I love that idea. I also saw a few comments about how that bottom white diamond on those three braids with the diamonds is not really appropriate, and I agree with that. Fortunately, I do have just a little bit of that dark teal left, so I'm going to rip that bottom part of my braid out and replace that white diamond with a piece of that dark teal, so it's one continuous chevron at the bottom of the braid, which I think will help just cement the shape that I'm going for when it's all said and done. When it comes to the background though, I didn't have a tan in my stash that worked because I don't usually work with browns, and I have like 3 pieces of fabric that are tan and none of them were the sand color I was looking for. And if I'm being honest, this quilt so far is 100% batik, and I kind of wanted to keep the background a batik fabric if I could. So it was off to the quilt store I went. Hubby and I went to the Quilter Studio in Fairfax, Virginia, where we browsed their selection of batiks. I found a couple at first that I thought might work, but after holding the braid up to it, they just didn't scream to me. They were the right color, I think, for sand, but they're either too dark or I didn't really love the print, and it just wasn't speaking beach to me. So I went back to the shelves and then I found the one. My jaw hit the floor as soon as I saw it on the shelf, and I knew immediately this was going to be the fabric that worked for the quilt. It is a beautiful, very soft tan, and the print on it is sand dollars. How cool is that? So I have the fabric. I know what I'm going to use for the background, but I haven't actually made a single stitch of progress on the Beachy Braid quilt, but I know where I'm going. So even though I didn't sew anything for the Beachy Braid quilt, I did do some sewing. If you missed it, on Friday night during the live stream, I got to piece this beautiful wall quilt that was included in the January 2023 Open Gate Quilts box. It is just gorgeous, and I am absolutely in love with it. It was a super easy and super quick sew. I had all of my fabric starched and cut out according to the pattern instructions before my live stream started, And within an hour, hour and a half, I had the whole project piece. Most of the time that I spent working on projects this week was actually on the Longarm. The first thing that I did was went into my stash and pulled out this beautiful block that I made a little over a year ago. This is an FPP block that I made with some beautiful purple and blue batik fabrics. And I've had it in my head that I wanted to make it a mini quilt or a mouse pad or a mug rug or something, and I just didn't know how to quilt it. But I decided today, or this week rather, was the time when I needed to conquer my fears and get it quilted. I loaded a single piece of backing that was going to serve as the backing for my dwell wall quilt, and I'll talk about that in a minute, as well as this block, and I got to work. I struggled with this one though, because I chose a thread color that really complemented the blues and the purples, but it contrasted drastically with the white background fabric. And so as a result, I can see every single stitch, which is not a great thing when you're a little rusty with your quilting. Rather than ripping out all of the stitches on that project, I decided to embrace it and just keep going, because ultimately what I'm trying to do is practice so that I can get better and progress my craft. If I don't quilt on the long arm, I'm not going to get better. Part of the journey to growing my skill is making those mistakes and learning how to not make them in the future. As I mentioned, I loaded the Dwell wall quilt onto the long arm because I wanted to quilt that too. And when I switched over to that quilt, I changed thread color so that my quilting would just add texture and I wouldn't really see the thread on the quilt. I wanted to let the fabric and the piecing shine. I didn't want to take away from it like I did on the other project. Unfortunately, I made a couple of boo-boos when I was threading the machine, and I didn't even realize it until after I started. The first thing that I did is I missed putting the thread in the little hook on top of the machine that takes the thread off of the mast and helps feed it into the tension disc. I missed that entirely. And I started stitching, and the machine didn't sound right, but did I stop? No. Did I test my tension before I started stitching on the project? No, not at all. But after I got about halfway done with that center piece of fabric on the quilt, I took a peek underneath. Boy, did I have a mess. It wasn't little bits of eyelashes or loops. It was like a ton. So I had to rip all of that out. That was fun. And then I went back and I fixed the threading of the machine and I started stitching again. And this time I did less, learning my lesson. But did I test the tension? No. Still didn't test the tension. And what happened? Same exact result underneath the quilt, because my thread wasn't snapped into the tension disc. So what was happening both times when I was quilting, there was no tension. So you can imagine how loosey-goosey all the threads were on the bottom of my quilt. Finally, I got all the tension issues situated and I was off and running, but then I hit one more snag. For some reason, I took a shortcut when I loaded the backing onto my long arm and I had a gap in between my red snap leaders. And so what was happening is every time I went to free motion quilt, there was always one spot where I couldn't get the machine to move. It was like there was something holding it back. And so every time I hit that spot, I'd stop and I'd look to see if the electrical cords were pulling, or maybe I had something under one of the wheels, or if it was hitting something that was on the table, maybe I had something left over there that was preventing the carriage from moving, and that wasn't the case. I gave up. I thought there was a ghost holding onto my machine that wouldn't let me quilt. And I walked away. And then I came back a few hours later and realized, oh, that gap in between the red snap leaders, the machine's going in that gap and it's hitting the edge of the red snap leader, which is pretty taut, and it's not letting the carriage move. I tell you all of this story to share that sometimes the best thing that you can do is walk away from a project. I hit 3 issues on that mini quilt, and it was frustrating me so much that I couldn't even think straight, and I was losing the joy in creating, and I had to walk away. I came back the next day though, and everything was clear as a bell. I could figure out exactly what was wrong. I was able to fix the problem, and I spent some fun time just stitching. Now, as of the recording of this video, that mini quilt is not finished through the quilting process. I've only quilted the center. I still have some quilting I want to do to it, but it is on my list of things to do next week. I also loaded all of my placemats onto the Longarm. I took a single piece of backing and batting and strategically placed all 8 of my placemats so that everything would fit onto that backing. And I did an all over meander with the same thread color, and then pulled it off, squared them up, and bound them, and they are on my table. When I laid them out to see how they looked, I realized that these could definitely go for Christmas, but they could also read as Valentine's placemats because they're very pinky kind of feeling. At least they are to me. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. The last project that I worked on this week was, of course, the Jolly Bar 4 Quilt Along. And this was another project that I had to set aside and walk away from for a little bit and come back to. And it wasn't because of the pattern. It was because I was sewing with distractions. So my tip for you this week with the Jolly Bar 4 Quilt Along is to remove distractions when you are trying to follow pattern instructions. Seriously, my husband was hanging out in the studio with me. We were watching Night Court. I was following the pattern and trying to sew, and all 3 of these things were happening at once. And I did not multitask so well. So I had to rip seams out a few times. Talking about ripping seams out, though, I do want to highlight last week my whoopsie daisy block was really an oopsie daisy block. I did not have my white squares aligned the right way, and several of you pointed that out in the comments. Thank you for that, by the way. And so I have since fixed that so that it is laid out the right way. This week, the one block that did give me the most confusion, and I think it was just because I had so much going on while I was sewing, was the larger of the 2 blocks. Make sure to read those instructions closely. You're going to need 8 pieces of Jolly Bar fabric representing 4 different prints. So that's 2 pieces of 4 different prints. I read it differently. I read that I needed 8 of the same fabric, and I started working with that and putting it together, and I realized I was wrong and I had to stop, undo, and start over. So that's the week in review. This next week, I've got some fun goals for myself. And first and foremost, at the top of the list is getting my computer stuff in order so that I can resume editing and uploading videos the way I used to do it before I started hitting all the computer problems. I also want to finish the Dwell quilt. It's already loaded on the Longarm. It's about halfway quilted, so why not finish it? Hopefully by the time I come to you next week for next week's vlog, that sucker will be quilted, bound, labeled, and even hanging on my wall. I want to make some progress with the beachy braid quilt. I don't know exactly how much progress I want to make, but wouldn't it be great if the entire quilt top was done by next Thursday? That's probably a very lofty goal for myself, but it is a goal, and we'll see if I can achieve it. If there was a theme to give this week, it would be frustration. I had it at the Longarm, I had it at the Juki, and I even had it with the computer. But I persevered, and in the end, made some progress on some projects, even if maybe I didn't absolutely love the quilting on that one block. Thank you guys so much for joining me in the journey, and I will see you next week. Bye!